of course, is unwell. And wait a moment, the recording. And so I wish him very, very fast recovery, and I hope he'll be back to speak to you in due course. And thank you for this series of very, very interesting lectures that you've organized. So thank you for that very nice invitation. I'm sure there was no need to read out all my publications, right? I'm, as you've heard, actually working primarily in the field of sociology, but my training was in philosophy originally, and my work continues to be still very much at the interface of sociology and philosophy, an area perhaps not very much explored, but fascinating because of the issues that it throws up for both sociologists and philosophers. And in these two lectures, actually, I will touch on some of these issues. I'm afraid I haven't got a PowerPoint for you today. I'm afraid I've only just come back to India. I've just spent 2 years in Japan, in Kyoto, teaching at the University of Kyoto in Japan, very famous university for its philosophical tradition. If I speak too quickly or you have any trouble with my accent or anything, please intervene at any point. So what I'd like to do is to make this a kind of very democratic kind of session, 2 sessions, a dialogue effectively, that I would like to raise a number of questions, and I hope that we will have time to discuss them, and either as in the chat box if you want to put your questions, or later on if you'd like to raise questions yourself, please don't be at all shy to do that. So let me start with the theme of the first of our sessions then, which is really on the question of ethics. And this is a question where the interface of sociology and philosophy actually is very critical. But let me ask you a couple of background questions before we start in on the kind of main theme. And you'll see it relates to the question of ethics. You're students of philosophy, and I'm sure you've asked yourself the question yourself in entering this field, what does philosophy do? What's it for? I mean, other than an intellectual discipline that's good for sharpening up your logic and things like this, does it in fact affect the real world? Is it a way in which we can actually intervene in the real world in such a way as to hopefully bring about kind of positive transformations? And part of the answer to that, I think, is obvious. Well, yes, we can give a number of answers to that question. What does philosophy do? What is philosophy for? For example, we can talk about the things that I'm sure you've talked about in class. Certainly when I first entered the study of philosophy as an undergraduate, we talked about things, of course, like the clarification of concepts, keeping our concepts clear, because it's true in everyday language, we do tend to use concepts in very, fuzzy, uncertain ways. We get away with this all the time. Philosophy can question, I think, underlying assumptions about our worldviews, the way we think about the world. Are those assumptions, in fact, accurate? And, I was, when I first studied philosophy, I studied it at a time when so-called linguistic philosophy or philosophy of language was very, very powerful tradition. And this was something, of course, we spent a lot of time doing, was in fact in the critique of language, thinking about the nature of language. But one of the other ways in which philosophy potentially can affect the world is to look at the question of ethics. Why ethics? Because, of course, ethics takes us into the question of examining behavior. It actually examines our empirical behavior, I mean, the way in which people are behaving in the world, the way in which we interact with one another, whether it's notions of honesty in business, whether it's notions of personal morality, relation to one another, or whether there are bigger questions here of what you might call social ethics, which I'll come to in a minute. Social ethics meaning the application of ethics, of course, to a whole range of issues which are now emerging in the global sphere. And in fact, I want to talk about those in a few minutes. Ethics, I think, is one of the primary ways in which philosophy can intervene in the world, because it looks at the ways in which motivations and ideas actually shape behavior. So in addition to the kind of theoretical questions, the grand classical questions in ethical theory, what is the right? Well, what is the good? We can also look at questions, of course, that I think many philosophers have, things like intention and motivation. There have been, of course, ethical theories which have discussed those kinds of issues, and perhaps you've talked about them in class. If I carry out an action with a very good intention, but its effect in the long term turns out to be bad, turns out to be negative for you. This was one of the issues that, for example, so-called utilitarianism has discussed. If I help you across the street, an elderly lady across the street, because she's having trouble with the traffic, that's a good act. If shortly after helping her across the street, she meets an accident of some kind, if I had not helped her across the street, she would never have met the accident. Was that action, because it was motivated by good intentions, essentially an ethical action? Or do we indeed measure ethical actions by their long-term consequences as they work out in the world? Or, of course, you could reverse that argument. If I do something from bad motivation, something that I intended to be dishonest, but in fact that motivation turned out, that action that I performed with really rather bad motives turned out, in fact, to be a positive one on its effect on another individual, on the world. How do we judge that kind of action? Was it, in fact, in a paradoxical way, ethical? Because its consequences were ethical, even though my original motivation for doing it was far from honorable. So we have a whole set of issues, of course, which I'm sure you've discussed in terms of the kind of classical issues of ethics. And these are extremely important. And of course, there are others as well. I mean, to what extent ethics is in fact rooted in religion, for example. Can you in fact detach ethical theories from a non-philosophical basis, in a sense, the way they've emerged, say, in Christian ethics or Islamic ethics or wherever? And indeed, that's a very, very interesting question. In a secularized world, do we find that a lot of our ethical thinking has been cut free from what was originally its religious basis? And insofar as society is secularized, is in fact the danger that ethical discourse faces. Difficult on the grounds that sometimes we might have difficulty in justifying a particular ethical decision. Why do you behave like this? Why are you honest? If in fact you could, I could improve my own personal lifestyle by being dishonest, by cheating you in my shop. I can make bigger profits. You suffer as the consumer, but I benefit as the person who is in fact making more money out of this, right? So why would you be honest, knowing that there are consequences which are, in a sense, at least in a material sense, positive for me? And indeed, it's sometimes difficult to answer those questions without, in fact, going back to try to root them in their religious and social point of origin. Bearing that in mind and thinking about the extent to which ethics is, in fact, rooted in the world around us, I think it's become a very, very cutting-edge area of philosophy, because the areas of ethical discourse which are now emerging are so extremely significant. And I want to mention a few of these, and please, these are not the only ones, please add to the list as we go along. Let me give you examples of what I mean by this expansion of ethical discourse. And I've written down 6 or 7, but I say you can probably think of others. And then maybe we can then discuss what sort of ethical discourse relates to these particular fields. Well, what's on my list? Some would surprise you, probably, okay? Some would not, I think. One of the very strongly emerging areas in ethics today is environmental ethics. We see all around us a kind of ecological crisis, right? Climate change is one of the biggest ones. I say it's very chilly in Mizoram. I say it's really very chilly here in Delhi. It always is in late December and in January, but I think this year is particularly cold, or at least I feel particularly cold. We see climate change working on us, and of course, if you begin to trace the effects of climate change, they are huge, right? They're going to affect agriculture. They would probably stimulate migration of people because of, in fact, the United Nations now recognizes a category of refugees, which they call environmental refugees. People displaced from their homeland by not because of political events, as is so often the case, but in this case, because of environmental change. Small island nations in the Pacific and Indian Ocean, the Maldives, other countries like this, potentially face the problem of, if not disappearing, becoming almost uninhabitable, because sea level rise would be such that, the storm surges and so on would flood their agricultural land. And even countries in South Asia, we're not so far from Bangladesh. And Bangladesh is likely, in fact, to be a country which is very severely affected by climate change. But of course, climate change is one of the most obvious dimensions of environment, but it's not the only one. Around us we see pollution, right? We see questions of resource extraction, whether people are mining, extracting oil, other resources from the ground. And here in parts of India, in Orissa, for example, you see the enormous environmental damage, which is done by mining companies, and the effect that kind of mining has had on local people. And in the case of Orissa, in many cases, these turn out to be Adivasi people, displaced from their homeland, displaced from their forms of traditional agriculture, and in many cases, essentially forced into working for example, coal mining companies, which has its own health hazards because of the dust and pollution that kind of mining generates. What this means, therefore, I think, is that the field of environmental studies poses very critical questions of ethics. How should we behave, in relation to the environment, which in turn raises another set of secondary questions. There are questions, I think, which are, how shall I put it, sensitive questions. Much of environmental change, of course, is driven by the nature of our economy. And therefore, if we wanted to enter into debate about right behavior in relation to the environment, we might find ourselves also having to raise questions about the nature of our economy. Okay. Now, to do that, you don't have to be necessarily radical. You don't have to be a Marxist or something, unless you want to be, okay? But it would pose similar kind of questions. Have we largely, especially in the industrialized countries, committed ourselves to a form of economic practice which benefits some people, but is having massive negative effects on the environment which we all share? And except in science fiction thinking, there isn't another planet, right? We all go and live on the moon. I personally don't particularly want to live on the moon. I kind of like the Earth. It's a very beautiful place in so many ways. Okay, that it's not the kind of environment most of us would like. Rocky, an atmosphere which has to be. We'd have to have artificial atmosphere and this kind of stuff. So the environment, I think, has become one of those areas in which philosophy can investigate very centrally, precisely because it raises substantial ethical issues, which are going to affect all of us. This is not a minority issue. Climate change is sooner or later going to reach everybody in its effects. A second area, which I find, again, very interesting, is medical ethics and the issues that arise from medical ethics. So sometimes people call bioethics. A very obvious example of this is, well, let me give you a concrete example. I was going to raise the question of cloning. Now, so far, cloning is, as far as human beings are concerned, is a theoretical idea. It is probably theoretically possible biologically. It's certainly never been achieved. I believe somebody cloned a sheep somewhere in Europe several years ago. Was the closest we got, but it does show that technically it is possible to clone higher level organisms. The example I had in mind is, you may have read about this. I was in Japan when this was happening, and I don't know if it's in the press here in India. Just a week or 10 days ago, a gentleman, I think in the US, with a heart problem, had a heart of a pig transplanted into him. And as far as I haven't heard the news in the last few days, I hope he's doing well. You know, there are dangers of the rejection, of course, of organs, that, a kidney, a heart, or something which is planted in your body. But that itself raises a very interesting question. How much of you could be replaced? Your kidneys, your heart, your liver, your lungs, or something, while you still retained a sense of identity. The question of medical ethics then raises actually all sorts of very, very significant questions. I saw an interview, again, just a couple of weeks ago, of a gentleman in Afghanistan, our neighbor on the other side, almost our neighbor on the other side, right? With the breakdown of the economy in Afghanistan after the Taliban takeover a couple of months ago, 2 or 3 months ago, 3 or 4 months ago, the economic situation is very, very serious. And it seems that part of the problem is that there is stuff to buy in some of the shops, but most people have no money. This gentleman was talking about actually selling one of his organs, probably one of his kidneys, because you can, under normal circumstances, stay alive on one kidney, simply to raise money. There is, in fact, quite a big international trade in organs, in harvested organs, which is a rather scary thought, isn't it? I mean, almost a kind of Frankenstein-like idea. The problem is, of course, number one, that people in poorer places, as in the case of the gentleman in Afghanistan, attempted to donate an organ simply for money, for cash. But that illustrates the fact that the flow is almost always from poor countries to rich countries. So, a wealthy donor in a so-called first world country who badly needs an organ that can be translated, if he or she can find an organ donor in a developing country, which they can afford to pay for that person to donate their organ, indicates again a kind of rather systemic kind of inequality. Globalization works to the benefit of some people. It doesn't necessarily work to the benefit of everybody, of course. And I think that question illustrates. Now, the question of organ transplants, the question of cloning, the question of receiving into your body an organ from a different kind of organism. In the case of the American gentleman, the pig, and I think the pig, because I think some pig organs are actually very close biologically, obviously, to human ones. Otherwise, this kind of transplantation would be impossible. The organ would be rejected. So there are many ethical issues there. I mean, there are ethical issues about, identity related to the possibility of cloning or organ transplants. And there are ethical issues related to issues of inequality. If I can afford an organ transplant, then I can potentially have one and, preserve my own health or life. Whereas the donor, of course, hopefully will continue to survive on with the missing organ, probably again a kidney. But should anything happen to their other remaining kidney, of course, they are the one who is going to be very, very unlikely to survive, because, of course, they could not themselves afford to have an organ transplant for themselves, having themselves donated. So the field of medical ethics, I think, is another cutting edge issue. And this is particularly the case because of the extent to which the medicalization of life is happening. And if you want just one final example here, I find out there are many examples I'm sure we could find. With the COVID pandemic, as I'm sure you've read, now India is in fact a major producer of vaccines. As you probably well know, particularly in Maharashtra and Pune, for example, is I think one of the largest manufacturers of vaccines that have been used in India. You probably had one, right? What are they called? COVID Shield? There were 2, right? Indian vaccines, COVID Shield, something, whatever, it doesn't matter. I was in Japan, I had a different one. I had Pfizer, which is one of the international ones. Now, the problem is, of course, that whereas in a country like Japan, at the time I left, almost all the population who desired a vaccination had been able to have one. I had my 2 shots, and in fact, if I'd stayed another month, I could have had a booster. I could have had a 3rd shot, right? Whereas, of course, there are many parts of the world, Africa and parts of Latin America, for example, where there is a serious shortage of COVID vaccines. Means, of course, that not only are those the people in those countries at much higher level of risk, okay, whether catching or as we now are seeing, if you are fully vaccinated on the whole, even though it doesn't prevent you necessarily catching Omicron, the probability is that your symptoms will be far milder. You know, that they will not be as devastatingly bad as they were with COVID-19 in the first and second waves that we saw. So again, questions of inequality and sharing immediately emerge with something like vaccination and the huge variations in vaccination possibility, depending on where you're lucky enough to live. Okay, and indeed, in some cases, even lucky enough to pay. The situation in Japan, where there's a very good system of socialized medicine, is that vaccination was free, completely free. You know, it costs nothing whatsoever to have yourself fully vaccinated. Now, there are many other areas, and these are a few to just alert us to the emerging areas of, I think, ethical discourse. On my list are a whole bunch, and I'll just tell you what they are, and if you'd like to discuss, you know, we can, or if you want to add to that list. I have a colleague here we have a very big law school here at Jindal University. And I noticed in the list of elective courses being taught across the university in the coming semester, one of my colleagues at the law school teaching a course on the law of outer space. Well, that's an interesting idea. I mean, most of us haven't been there, right? And most of us probably don't plan to go there. And in fact, except for you know, that tiny number of astronauts who do get launched into space, and 1 or 2 billionaires allowing, you know, providing like kind of private tours to kind of inner space. I don't think they've got very far yet. Most of us aren't going to go into space. So, well, what's the issue with space, and why is it potentially an ethical issue? I don't know if anybody realizes how much junk is flying around in space above our heads all the time. Hundreds and thousands of discarded satellites, for example, something we forget about. You know, if we have Google Maps on our phone, you know, we want to navigate with our phone, we turn on our smartphone and we can locate ourselves, we can locate the destination we want to go to. Of course, that technology requires the use of satellites. You know, GPS obviously needs this. We probably don't think very much about what happens to those satellites when their, you know, natural lifespan is over. And the answer is, of course, they circulate in space until, in some cases, their orbit degenerates to the point when they re-enter the Earth's atmosphere. Now, 99% of them, when that happens, burn up on entry. They vaporize, essentially. They're not much danger to those of us on the ground. Not all of them burn up. Some of them are likely to land somewhere on the Earth's surface. Of course, this is highly unpredictable, that someone would be hit by a piece of space debris, you know, from a disused satellite or one of these space stations, the International Space Station and so on, if or when it ever enters the Earth's orbit. I thought that was a very interesting subject to be teaching. I don't know what the law of outer space is, right? But I assume that the international legal community, which of course law is obviously intimately connected with the question of ethics, because we hope that laws are indeed ethical in their intention and application, is that we don't think about it, but how much dangerous stuff is circulating in the air above us. You know, we can't see it, we're not aware of it, of course. A fascinating question. If I bump into him on campus, if campus reopens, I'd actually like to ask him a little bit more about this. What is the law of outer space? Presumably space about responsibility for the objects that you put up there. And again, this is not just a theoretical question. I don't remember when, 3, 4, 5 months ago, the Chinese launched a satellite, a rocket bearing a satellite, which was not planned to re-enter safely. Now, the most space capsules, you know, manned space capsules, which is, I'm sure you know, you see this in movies too, of course, which are launched into space, have a re-entry mechanism. They re-enter, they have parachutes and so on. And, you know, nowadays the technology is such that, you know, almost the exact point of re-entry of touchdown can be, it's usually in the sea, of course. You've probably seen this on TV or somewhere. capsule arriving in the sea and, recovery ships waiting in the area so they can quickly fish the thing out of the water and open the capsule, take the astronauts, let the astronauts out, right? This vehicle that the Chinese launched had no re-entry mechanism. That is to say that having reached its trajectory, it would simply re-enter the Earth's atmosphere, which it did. And I think fortunately it landed somewhere where it didn't hurt anybody in the Gobi Desert or somewhere like this. But there are many, many issues of this kind. So what I'm trying to alert ourselves to is the fact that the whole field of ethics has immensely expanded. I have other things on my list. Of course, I mentioned economics. The whole question of human rights in relation to responsibilities. I've heard it said, and I don't know if anybody can confirm this, that when Mahatma Gandhi, when the UN came up with this idea of formulating a universal declaration of human rights, right? A document, I think, signed by virtually every government in the world. I hope it has been. India is certainly a signatory of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Do read it if you haven't. Of course, it's very easily accessible online in lots of versions, right? Lots of languages. It said that when Gandhi was approached to lend his great kind of moral authority to supporting this idea of a universal declaration of human rights, he's supposed to have said, I would do that as long as it's balanced by a universal declaration of human responsibilities. Now, that's an interesting idea, right? The rights discourse, of course, is critically important, right? In protecting people, in assuring that legal norms are indeed observed, that people have, fair trial, and all of those things that are implied by the notion of human rights. But it is an interesting question to think of Gandhi's issue, if indeed he did say this, probably buried somewhere in the 100+ volumes, 100 volumes of his collected works. I've never looked for it exactly, but it's probably there somewhere. Okay, is this a good question? Is this a good ethical issue to take up? That indeed, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights should be balanced, as it were, by a Universal Declaration of Human Responsibilities. Let me just take two more examples very briefly, and then perhaps draw out some implications of this. We mentioned economics, for example. We mentioned globalization. Now, when you put together globalization and the questions of environmental ethics, one of the things that emerges out of that equation, of course, are migrants, as we suggested, climate migrants, people forced out of their habitat by climate change, not by political warfare, civil war or something you saw in countries like Syria, for example. Although interestingly, I don't know if you're aware of this, many people trace the origin of conflict in Syria to climate change. Prior to the outbreak of civil disturbances in Syria several years ago, Syria had experienced around 3 years of severe drought. And that drought, of course, had displaced large numbers of farmers from their normal occupation into migrating, basically migrating to cities or trying to find some kind of alternative work, or in extreme cases, migrating to a neighboring country, crossing into Turkey or to Jordan or elsewhere. Now, as this problem of migration is, in fact, internationally a very big one. Europe has received hundreds of thousands of migrants from all over the place, from all over the world, from Africa, people crossing, I'm sure again you're aware of this, people crossing the Mediterranean in little boats trying to reach Spain or Italy or Greece, the southern countries of Europe in very large numbers. What are our responsibilities towards people like this? Now, environmental refugees are only one category of migrant. Of course, there are at least two other categories of migrant. There are, how shall I put it, regular migrants. I mean, I suppose technically I'm a migrant, right? I wasn't born in India, but I'm living and working here. So I suppose I'm a migrant too. What are my rights? Should I be protected under Indian law to the same extent as any Indian citizen should have the rights? Or are migrants marginalized in some respects, not having access in quite the same way to all of the facilities available to a citizen? Now, of course, it's understood that certain of those rights are in fact denied to migrants. For example, the right to vote in a general election. it's the right of a citizen to do this, not of migrants to participate directly in the political process. But I mean, we've seen this situation in India too. I mean, with Rohingya migrants entering India from Bangladesh, from Burma, from Myanmar, was the responsibility of India towards migrants this kind who are largely displaced, not by environment in this case, but by politics, by persecution of some kind. This is becoming a very big question, say, across the world. It's become a major political issue in Europe. And in fact, you may know, in my view, a disastrous mistake, but what was it, 3 years ago, the UK voted to leave the European Union. The process known as Brexit, separated itself from the European continent. I think this was an extremely stupid thing to do for lots of reasons I'm going to now, okay? But the point is, one of the arguments for those who were arguing for separation from Europe was that then Britain could protect its borders. Britain itself could decide who to admit migrants, to admit refugees or not, okay? And since the number of migrants and refugees living in continental Europe are far bigger than those currently living in the UK, that motive of separation from Europe was partly driven by a point of view, an ethical point of view about responsibility towards migrants. Should a country open its borders to refugees or not, or to what extent? Now, there are many other questions. And actually, I suppose it's part of environmental ethics, but one quite big area of ethical discourse that's now emerged is, in fact, about the rights of nature or not. Do animals, for example, have rights in the same sense as we can extend the notion of rights to human beings? Again, there are various arguments, of course. From religious perspective, some people have said, no, animals don't have rights, they don't have souls, right? Assuming human beings have souls, then animals don't. So they're a kind of different category. They're living beings of a kind, but they're not in the same category as human beings. But can we, in fact, extend an ethical discourse of rights to animals? And some people have even suggested, of course, to other entities in nature, to trees, to plants, right? The plants in some sense have rights. Very interesting question, because of course it not only supposes the expansion of the notion of ethics, but it also raises rather new philosophical questions. For example, what is a living being? And is a plant, clearly biologically alive in some sense, but does that biological aliveness mean that we should extend to it the same kind of rights discourse that we would extend to human beings? Or, alternatively, is our idea of human rights a very anthropocentric idea? I like human rights because I'm a human. So I want, the rights applied to me. I want protection under the law. But I couldn't care less about animals because I'm not an animal, right? I'm not a human. And if I was an animal, I probably would not, of course, be able to articulate my desire to be protected under some kind of rights regime. But the borders here are very fuzzy. And I think this is an interesting contemporary question too in philosophy, notably that it's quite clear that particularly so-called higher animals are sentient in various ways. Whales are very smart. Dolphins are very smart. They don't communicate in the same way, right? The so-called higher apes are very smart. Dogs and cats in many ways are very smart and have sensitivity to all sorts of conditions. And many of us have had that probably kind of experience. Even a cat recognizing that you're sad, recognizing that you're upset in some way. And I have a friend's cat very grumpy cat, didn't really like being picked up and played with, the way we often like to do with pets. But it became clear as I knew that and got to know that animal better, that it was very sensitive to people's moods. If someone was upset about something, it would come to you. It recognized that you were in emotional distress about something, and would respond to that by trying to provide comfort, allowing itself to be petted in the way in which under normal conditions it wouldn't. So we have a whole bunch of very, very interesting questions there. Let me try to draw this together a little bit so we have plenty of time for discussion. What are some of the implications of this? Well, number one, as I've suggested, is the expansion of ethical discourse to areas which are now, I think, globally important, environment, medicine, space, maybe the sea, migrants, maybe animals, and so forth. That's one area. The second area is that it challenges the boundaries of philosophical thinking when we're thinking about notions like identity, or indeed notions like what constitutes life. Now, those issues have come up, of course, in other contexts, in the borders of medical ethics and, or on the borders of medical ethics. And the example I'm thinking of there is, of course, the question of abortion. Now, in many countries or states within countries which allow abortion, there's almost always a rule about at what point a fetus is considered to be sentient, to be actually, it's always alive in some biological sense, of course, from conception, okay? But in certain cases, abortion is only allowed up until the point in which it's decided that, the fetus is sentient. After that, abortion, in fact, becomes a kind of murder.
Hello? Sorry, we're stuck. We don't seem to have any internet connection issue here.
doing participants.